All right. Like you said, my name is Scott Rose. I am a computer scientist at the IT lab in NIST here in Gaithersburg, Maryland, and we are part of the Department of Commerce. And we work primarily to one of our missions is to help other federal agencies with their IT, both cybersecurity and general IT research and development. And as one of the kind of the trends, just like in the private sector, there's kind of these growing trend towards zero trust. We've had, obviously there's been some well-known and well-documented issues and breaches, especially in the last few months. But even going back to, say, 2012, where there's been where an attacker has gotten in somehow, usually like a phishing attempt or some sort of zero-day, and exfiltrated some data because they were able to move laterally through the network and they were able to obtain what they need, or even have persistent access to the network. So this federal CIO council heard, about this new trend. Back then it was called zero trust networking, but then we kind of evolved to zero trust architecture. And they thought there needs to be some sort of reference architecture, or at least a conceptual framework to help federal agencies who want to move towards zero trust architecture kind of get their minds around it, to see like what are they doing when they're talking about it, and more importantly, what are they doing when they're talking to their procurement officials and to vendors, so they can actually purchase what they need and deploy what they need and actually set up something to improve their state of security. So we came up with this guide. It's published as NIST Special Publication 800-207, Zero Trust Architecture. And in there, this is a conceptual framework. There's no hard guidance in this document. This is meant to be more of a definition type document. NIST actually has published some others. One about IoT, some on cloud computing, where it kind of roughly define these set of terms. So we have a common sense of framework when we're talking to everybody else. What do we mean by when we say this? And for example, we define like zero trust. And when we mean zero trust, and we want people to talk about when they say zero trust, is a set of principles. There is no single zero trust technology or architecture or something like that where you can point to and say that's zero trust. It's actually a set of principles that are guiding the way you deploy and use and configure your IT infrastructure. And building on top of that, zero trust architectures, we're saying it's basically an architecture that is based off of on those ZT principles. So people that believe in those ZT principles, they're buying into it as the tenants and saying, okay, now we're designing our architecture around these and our workflows and our business models. And lastly, a zero trust enterprise is basically any kind of organization that's using a zero trust architecture or trying to deploy and implement it. That way, so you can say like, hey, we have when one agency says to another, we have a trust architecture, the other agency go, yeah, I know what that means. It means you're following a set of zero trust principles. But in, at a broad sense, you look down below, it's kind of, you have an untrusted zone. You're going from an untrusted zone, a subject, from a device, a user, going through a policy enforcement point or in a policy decision point to access a resource. And the idea is you want to shrink that implicit trust zone to be as small as possible. And that's in a nutshell, that's what we consider zero trust. In the guide, in the special publication, we laid out about 7 tenets, we're calling them. These are the zero trust principles. They're one of several. We're not calling it the strictly definitive one. In fact, there are several other kind of sets of principles out there. I think one's from like Forrester. I think there's one coming out of the UK. All of these can be mapped one-to-one because they all basically are saying the same thing. And a few of our tenets, you can kind of break them down into ones that are user-centric about identity and access and authorization. Some are device-centric about device health, patching and updating and monitoring the devices, and some that are kind of data-centric or workflow-centric, we're calling them. This is like end-to-end encryption, continuous monitoring and logging of activity. The two things that set up our principles or tenets from other ones is we take a more general approach. We call instead of taking a data-centric approach, we're calling it basically resource-centric. We're calling anything a resource because it's not just your data sources that are important, but also the end systems that people are using, mobile devices that people are using, any kind of IoT deployments, compute resources. All of those should be protected in a zero trust architecture. And lastly, we're not taking a hard stance on deep packet inspection, as people call it, when it comes to end-to-end. because we know that there are several protocols coming out that actually are used to defeat third-party monitoring. A lot of these third-party man-in-the-middle network taps that people have been relying on for security are actively viewed as attacks by some protocol standard-setting bodies. And so there's got to be ways around that. You have to maybe admit that sometimes you may not be able to monitor all the traffic on your network, or you may not want to monitor all the network traffic, maybe due to some compliance reasons. Like in the U.S., you may have HIPAA traffic crossing your network for health information. You may not want your IT staff to have full access to that data. But then we came up with this we're calling it a basic logical architecture. Again, this is all in the guide, but we kind of broke down the kind of major logical components. Now, these are not may not be actual software components operating in a network, but they serve a kind of a logical function. And again, you have the subject and the system, and they're going through a policy enforcement point. That's kind of the gatekeeper. Think of that as the bouncer that's standing in front of the resource, whatever that is, database, web app, IoT device, who cares? And then we separated out the policy decision point into two components. We're calling it the policy engine and the policy administrator. Think of the policy engine as the brains of Zero Trust. That is actually doing any kind of calculation of either your trust score, confidence level, whatever you want to call it, or performing a series of checks to say, is this access request legitimate or not? Or should I authorize this or not? Is the user been authenticated? Is the device up to a corporate policy? Is the environmental factor okay? Are they coming from a valid network or a known bad set of IP addresses? And then do I allow that access request? It's a binary yes, no at that point. And then the administrator is the executor of that decision. It says, okay, it talks to the policy enforcement points to allow or shut down that connection. In some cases, in some products we're seeing out there, the policy engine and the policy administrator are kind of one blob that's sometimes located in the cloud. But they're served, these are two distinct logical functions as we kind of seen it. And the things coming in from the left and the right, these are all the kind of like the data sources that help the policy engine in its actual decision making. You got ID management systems, data policies, threat intelligence, activity logs. That's the feedback loop. And lastly, at least one thing that's different that people outside of the government may not know is the one in the upper left. We're calling it a CDM system. That's there's another government policy. It's continuous diagnostics and mitigation. That's kind of device health and network monitoring program in the U.S. government. We've seen that that's a previous program that's been going on for several years out of the Department of Homeland Security for agencies. And we're seeing that as that's kind of a prototype of Zero Trust. They were kind of being Zero Trust before the rest of us recognized that as Zero Trust. And so we're saying that we're building upon that success to make a full Zero Trust architecture. And then in our work, we interacted with a lot of vendors and brought them in, and we had an interagency meeting, and we kind of broke down a lot of what we saw into kind of various approaches and deployment models for Zero Trust. Again, this is kind of help formulate kind of conceptual models. We found three main approaches. Again, there's basically this is what is the load bearing technology in your ZTA, and that's we're kind of thinking is either what we're calling enhanced identity governments. That's the kind of the identity based models that you've seen, micro segmentation based. Again, that could be through smart firewalls, appliances, whatever. And then the software-defined perimeter kind of approach, and that's kind of where that you see this in a lot of the software-defined networking. There's kind of intent-based networking technologies out there. Those kind of ideas, kind of especially for cloud-based stuff, and all these are different kind of approaches to Zero Trust. Is like where do you put that emphasis on? Again, but in a full Zero Trust architecture, you're going to find elements of all three because all three are kind of important. You need to have this kind of micro-segmentation of resources away from each other to prevent lateral movement. Identity is very important to Zero Trust. And then for cloud-based stuff, you can't do a lot of micro-segmentation because it's all software-based. So you have software-based perimeters and those sort of things. So you'll find elements of all three. And then there's deployment models. Again, we're kind of saying this is what we've kind of seen out there. A lot of it is agent gateway based, and that is where that PEP, that policy enforcement point, is broken up into two components: one that resides on the client machine and one that sits in front of any kind of resource. A portal is just kind of the same thing, only there's no agents sitting on the client. And then we've seen some, application sandbox kind of things. All these models may work. It's just depending on what vendor you're using. And you may have different models for different workflows, depending your HR systems that we're doing employee onboarding may use a different set of systems than your mobile teleworkers out there that are submitting reports from, while on the road. Then we kind of go into like where do we start? Again, we're trying to help agencies kind of develop a conceptual framework and move forward in deploying their own zero trust architecture. There are two main things that you need to do, at least start the groundwork. One is technical, and you need to have an inventory of everything. You need to know what is on your network, what is enterprise owned versus not. Who are the users? What are their accounts? These are not just user accounts. You got to think system accounts. Any kind of AI systems that may be out there. What are the actual workflows in the enterprise? Not just what is your business processes or what is your mission when it comes to agencies, but how do these things actually happen? Who is involved? What do they do and at what time and what order? And then the other one is cultural. Again, we've heard some talk in some previous talks. Silos are kind of a big thing. In the government, we sometimes refer to those as cylinders of excellence. But the idea is that you need to get teams connected. You got to find out who owns the data or who owns these processes, because they're going to be the champions of that, and you need to bring them into the table in order to develop these policies. And the security team can't just sit back off on their own, look at a set of checkboxes and say, yes, this is good security, everybody do this. Because that becomes quite onerous, and the operations teams then see this and say these don't work, and they and then they try to find ways to work around it, and again, then you get shadow IT problem. So the idea is that you need to get these teams connected. The security team needs to talk to operations, and both teams need to talk to the actual workflow owner. So, again, going back to the HR model. Who does employee onboarding? How do they do that? Who exactly is involved? And you can't develop these policies until you actually know that. So it's kind of it's a team effort to develop a zero trust architecture. But to wrap up, our publication is out there. It's free. It's on the internet. It's a public resource. And on top of that, there is what it's an entity known as associated with NIST, the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. It's a research lab. They have a building block project where they're actually trying to demonstrate some of these architectures that we've written in the guide. Right now, it's focused on resource access. So they're doing things such as on-prem access by employees of the enterprise, collaboration scenarios, branch office scenarios, remote workers, both trying to reach resources on-prem and in the cloud. Basically, they're trying to run through all these kind of access scenarios, and they're bringing in a bunch of vendors. Vendors join in. It's a cooperative agreement between the public sector and these private vendors to develop what they call a practice guide. And the practice guide describes how they built their solution to these problems. How did they meet these scenarios? And it's more, it's partially a kind of a descriptive guide about, what is the problem they're trying to tackle. And at the end, it's kind of more of a how-to cookbook guide of saying, how did they actually use these vendor products, these vendor participants? How did we configure them, set them up to actually go through these scenarios? So it's kind of a cookbook thing at the end. So they're going to be developing that. It's probably going to be about a year-long project. That's underway right now. I think they are identifying the vendor collaborations. We've had a lot of interest from the vendor community to participate, and I think it's just resource constrained as to how many we can invite in for the first wave, and then there might be building blocks on top of that. And lastly, some contact information both for the NCCOE project, and then the two of the NIST authors for the Zero Trust Architecture document there. Again, feel free to reach out if anybody's interested. There is a community of interest, especially I know for the NCCOE project. That'll be kind of announcement email, as well as maybe a kind of a forum collaborative space for people to contribute and review some of the work that as it's ongoing, and provide feedback to kind of improve it. So that's kind of a whirlwind review of SP 800-207 and kind of the Zero Trust project here at NIST. If there's any questions, I guess I could take them now.